The brass keys felt heavy in Martha's hand, a weight far greater than the few ounces of metal they truly were. She stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk of the city center, her old canvas coat a stark contrast to the towering wall of glass and steel before her. 6 years ago, she had been ushered out of these very doors, with nothing but the dust on her boots and the sound of mocking laughter ringing in her ears. Now the shadow of the First National Bank building stretched across the street, but it didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a harvest. If you believe that the quiet strength of the earth eventually outlasts the noise of the greedy, subscribe to Beyond the Fields and stay with me. Today, we look at what happens when a woman who knows the value of dirt takes on the men who only value paper. Martha's story didn't start under the city lights. It began in the mud and the mist of the Blackwood Valley. Farm was 300 acres of stubborn rock and ancient timber, a place the locals called the Hardscrabble. Father had worked it until his heart gave out, and her grandfather before him had pulled stones from the earth until his knuckles were permanently swollen. It was a dairy farm by name, but it was a battleground by nature. Every morning at 4, the air would be so cold it felt like breathing glass. Martha would step out of the back porch, her lantern casting long, flickering shadows against the barn walls. The cows were hers, and she knew every one of them by the notch in their ear or the way they carried their weight. But the world was changing. The price of milk was dropping faster than a lead weight in a pond, and the equipment was tired. The tractor, a rusted beast from the 50s, required a prayer and a hammer strike just to turn over. To the outside world, the Hardscrabble was a failing enterprise, a relic of a dead era. To Martha, it was her skin and bone. She saw the way the morning sun hit the south ridge, turning the frosted grass into a field of diamonds. She knew where the creek ran deep even in the driest August, and she knew that beneath the rocky topsoil laid a clay that held onto life with a grip, like iron. People in town would pass her in their shiny trucks, shaking their heads at the woman in the grease-stained overalls. They saw a woman losing a fight against time. They saw a dirt-poor farmer clinging to a sinking ship. But they didn't see the way she looked at the soil. Martha didn't just walk the land, she listened to it. When the corporate scouts came by, offering pennies on the dollar to turn her pastures into a subdivision for commuters, she didn't even let them finish their pitch. She'd just point to the gate and go back to her chores. They called her stubborn. They called her foolish. But Martha knew that once you pave over the soul of the earth, you never get it back. The debt was mounting, though. The feed bills were stacking up on the kitchen table like a paper mountain, and the local co-op was starting to look the other way when she walked in. She needed a lifeline, not for herself, but for the legacy that lived in the fence lines. She needed a loan to pivot, to save the herd, and to fix the roof that let the winter rain drown the hay. She looked at her calloused palms, scrubbed as clean as they would get, and decided it was time to talk to the men who kept the ledger of the world. She dressed in her Sunday best, a floral print dress that smelled of cedar and old memories, and drove the rattling truck toward the city. The transition from the green silence of the valley to the gray noise of the city was always a shock. The buildings seemed to lean over the streets, suffocating the air. She felt small, but she reminded herself that the milk from her cows had built half the bones in this county. She walked into the bank with her head held high, carrying a folder of handwritten ledgers that detailed every gallon produced and every penny saved. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was asking for a partnership. She believed that the bank would see what she saw, a business with deep roots that just needed a little water to survive the drought. She sat in the lobby for 2 hours, watching people in sharp suits hurry past with eyes that never met hers. To them, she was a ghost of a world they had forgotten. But Martha waited. She had learned patience from the seasons. You can't hurry the corn, and you can't hurry the rain. Finally, a young woman with a tight smile told her that Mr. Sterling would see her now. Martha stood up, straightened her dress, and walked toward the heavy oak doors that led to the inner sanctum of the First National Bank. Mr. Sterling sat behind a desk that looked like it cost more than Martha's entire herd. It was a vast expanse of polished mahogany, devoid of a single speck of dust or a stray hair. He didn't stand when she entered. He didn't even look up at first. He was busy scribbling something on a piece of paper with a gold-plated pen, his movements fluid and rehearsed. Sterling was a man who lived in the world of interest rates and quarterly projections. To him, the sun was something that caused a glare on his computer screen, and the rain was just a reason to take a taxi. When he finally looked up, his eyes were as cold and blue as a winter pond. He didn't see a woman who had spent 40 years tending to life. He saw a high-risk liability. He gestured to the chair across from him, and Martha sat, feeling the weight of her ledgers in her lap. She began to speak, her voice steady and low. She talked about the history of the hardscrabble, about the quality of the soil, and her plan to shift from traditional dairy to organic specialty cheeses that the high-end markets in the city were starting to crave. She showed him her numbers, the careful calculations of a woman who had learned math by counting grains of seed and bags of lime. Sterling didn't even open the folder. He leaned back, his silk tie shimmering under the fluorescent lights. He began to talk about asset liquidity and market volatility. He used words that were designed to sound like wisdom but felt like a wall. He told her that the dairy industry was a corpse that just hadn't realized it was dead yet. He laughed when she mentioned the value of the land itself. To him, land was only valuable if it could be divided into 60-foot lots and sold to developers. He looked at Martha's weathered face, the fine lines around her eyes carved by decades of squinting into the sun, and he saw a relic. He saw a person who belonged in a history book, not a boardroom. He told her that the bank didn't deal in sentiment. They dealt in growth. And from where he sat, Martha was the opposite of growth. She was a holdout. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with a patronizing kindness that felt worse than a slap. He suggested she sell the farm to one of his clients, holding company that specialized in land reclamation. He told her she could take the money, move into a nice condo in the city, and finally rest. He spoke as if the land was a burden she was too old to carry, rather than the very thing that gave her strength. Martha listened, hands gripped tightly in her lap. She felt the heat rising in her neck, not from embarrassment, but from a quiet, burning anger. This man, who couldn't tell a heifer from a bull, was telling her the value of her life's work. He saw the world as a series of numbers on a screen, detached from the sweat and the blood that made those numbers possible. He saw the bank as a fortress of power, and himself as the gatekeeper. To him, Martha was just a beggar at the gate, someone to be dismissed so he could get back to his lunch reservation. He checked his watch, a heavy gold piece that caught the light, and stood up. The meeting was over. He hadn't even looked at her plan. He hadn't even considered the possibility that the earth held more value than his spreadsheets could calculate. He stood there, the embodiment of corporate arrogance, convinced that he held all the cards and that Martha was just a losing hand. The laughter was what cut the deepest. As Martha gathered her papers, Sterling chuckled, a dry, rhythmic sound that lacked any real mirth. He told her that he admired her luck, but that the bank only bet on winners. He joked that perhaps she should try a bake sale instead of a commercial loan. Martha didn't respond. She simply closed her folder and stood up. As she walked toward the door, she heard him speaking to his secretary, his voice loud enough to carry. He called her the little lady from the dirt and made a comment about the smell of manure. Martha walked through the lobby, past the polished brass and the marble floors, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the street. The rain had started, a cold, gray drizzle that soaked through her dress in seconds. She stood there for a moment, the city noise swirling around her, feeling the full weight of the refusal. It wasn't just about the money. It was the total dismissal of her worth as a human being. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had delivered calves in the middle of snowstorms and repaired fences in the blistering heat. Those hands were worthless to the bank. She felt a surge of shame, a cold realization that the world she loved was being eaten by men like Sterling. But then, as the rain ran down her face, something shifted. The shame began to harden. It didn't melt away. It tempered into a cold, sharp resolve. She thought about the clay on the hardscrabble. The harder you hit it, the more it resisted. She wasn't going to sell. She wasn't going to go to a condo. She was going to find a way, and she was going to do it without their permission. She walked back to her truck, the old engine groaning as it started, and drove out of the city. As she reached the edge of the Blackwood Valley, the rain began to let up, and a sliver of sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the hills. The land didn't care about asset liquidity. The land didn't laugh. The land just waited. Martha got home, changed into her work clothes, and walked out to the barn. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She picked up a shovel and started to work. She had a new plan, one that didn't involve mahogany desks or silk ties. She would work twice as hard, sleep half as much, and save every penny. She would diversify, she would innovate, and she would move in the shadows. The bank thought she was finished, but they forgot one thing about farmers. We are used to long winters. We know how to survive on nothing until the spring comes. She looked toward the horizon, where the city lights were just a faint orange glow against the clouds. She whispered to the wind, "I'll see you again." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. She knew that the arrogance of men like Sterling was their greatest weakness. They thought they were the masters of the world, but they were just building castles on sand. Martha had her feet on the rock, and she was prepared to wait for the tide to turn. The next 6 years were a blur of grit and silence. Martha didn't just work, she transformed. She realized that the old way of doing things was the path to the grave the bank wanted for her. She stopped selling her milk to the corporate giants for pennies. Instead, she invested in a small, used pasteurizer and began making artisanal cheeses in her own kitchen. She worked 18-hour days, turning the curds by hand, experimenting with herbs she grew in her own garden. She started small, selling at local farmers' markets, calloused hands offering samples to city folk who had never tasted anything that didn't come from a plastic tub. The response was immediate. People didn't just want the cheese. They wanted the story. They wanted the taste of the hardscrabble. Slowly, the trickle of cash turned into a steady stream. Martha didn't spend a dime on herself. She wore the same patched coveralls and drove the same rattling truck until the floorboards rusted through, and then she fixed them with scrap metal and rivets. She took the profits and bought the neighboring 100 acres when the owner passed away. Land the bank had overlooked because it was too steep for houses. But that land was perfect for sheep. She added sheep's milk to her repertoire, creating a blend that won a national award she didn't even show up to collect. While she was building her empire out of dirt and sweat, the world of the bank was changing too. Martha kept a close eye on the financial news. She saw the headlines about aggressive expansion and risky investment portfolios. She saw the First National Bank, under the leadership of men like Sterling, pouring money into high-stakes real estate and complex derivatives. They were building a mountain of paper, convinced it was solid ground. Martha, meanwhile, was burying her wealth in the soil. She bought equipment in cash at auctions. She repaired her barns. She moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency. She became a ghost in the local economy, a woman who had no debt and no paper trail that the big banks cared about. She was a winner now, but not by their definition. She was winning because she owned every inch of her world. Every cow, every blade of grass, and every brick was hers. By the 5th year, she had hired 3 local families who had lost their own farms to help her. She paid them well, and she taught them the value of the land. She was rebuilding a community that the banks had tried to dismantle. And then the air began to change. The market, once so bloated and confident, started to wheeze. The high-risk gambles of the city men began to fail. Interest rates spiked, and the land reclamation projects ground to a halt. Martha watched as the First National Bank stock began to tumble. She saw the news reports of executive bonuses being paid while the bank's reserves were drying up. She knew the cycle. She had seen it in the seasons. When you take too much from the land without giving back, the land eventually stops providing. The bank had been taking from everyone, and now they were empty. Martha went to her safe in the floor of the pantry and counted the certificates of deposit and the cash she had accumulated. It was a harvest unlike any she had ever seen. She waited for the perfect moment, the moment when the arrogance of the city would finally meet the reality of the earth. The collapse of the First National Bank was sudden and violent. It was the lead story on every channel, a tale of corporate greed and mismanagement that had left a hole in the city's heart. The massive glass building, once a symbol of unshakable power, was being liquidated to pay off creditors. The auction was held on the very steps where Martha had stood in the rain 6 years prior. A crowd had gathered: reporters, former employees with stunned faces, and vultures looking to pick the bones of the fallen giant. Martha arrived in her truck, the engine humming a low, steady tune. She wore her old canvas coat, the one that smelled of wood smoke and rain. She walked through the crowd, a weathered woman in a sea of suits that were starting to look frayed at the edges. She saw Sterling standing near the auctioneer's podium. He looked 10 years older. His hair was thin, his silk tie was crooked, and the arrogance had been replaced by a desperate, twitching anxiety. He was no longer the gatekeeper. He was a footnote. The auctioneer began the proceedings, his voice a rapid-fire drone that felt like a funeral march. When he opened the bidding for the main headquarters, a few corporate representatives made half-hearted offers. The numbers were high, but they were cautious. Then Martha raised her hand. The crowd went silent. The auctioneer paused, looking at the woman in the canvas coat. He asked her to verify her bidding status. Martha didn't say a word. She stepped forward and handed over a certified check from a small, local credit union, the kind of bank that still knew its customers by name. It was for the full amount. The hush that fell over the crowd was absolute. Sterling stared at her, his mouth hanging open, a flicker of recognition finally crossing his face. He looked at the woman he had called the little lady from the dirt, and he saw the person who now held his world in her hands. He tried to speak, to say something about the irony, or perhaps to ask for a job, but the words died in his throat. Martha didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the same flat, honest gaze she used on a fence post that needed replacing. The auctioneer's hammer came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Sold," he whispered. Martha took the documents, the heavy brass keys, and the deed to the property. She stood on the top step, looking out over the city she had once feared. She didn't feel like a queen. She felt like a farmer who had finally finished a long day's work. She had bought the building not because she wanted to be a banker, but because the land needed to reclaim what was hers. She intended to turn the lobby into a year-round market for the valley's farmers, a place where the people who actually produced something could meet the people who needed it. She would turn the offices into a training center for sustainable agriculture. The bank was gone, and in its place, a harvest was beginning. I stood there for a long time, watching the sunset reflect off the glass of a building I now owned. It's funny how the world works. The men in the tall towers think they're the ones in control because they have the ink and the paper. But they forget that paper comes from trees, and trees come from the dirt. The land is the only thing that's real. It's the only thing that doesn't lie to you. It teaches you that if you're patient, if you're willing to put your hands in the cold mud and wait for the sun, the harvest will always come. Sterling and his kind, they're like annual weeds. They grow fast, they take up all the space, and they look impressive for a season. But farmers, we're like the oaks. We grow slow, we sink our roots deep into the rock, and we're still standing long after the weeds have withered in the frost. True power isn't found in a polished desk or a gold watch. It's found in the calloused palms of those who refuse to give up on the earth. The bank laughed at a loan request, but the land had the final word, and the land always speaks the truth.